Soldiers' Belts, brought from the Raktong River line. Entry by Kang Yong-sun. The sky seemed obscured by clouds of smoke, and the whine of bullets was deafening. Enemy planes were flying low over the Raktong River. The sound of bombs and shells exploding was ear-splitting. Soldiers were shouting, and the wounded were groaning. A cacophony of noises and voices was bubbling all around. Bombing raids raging on, the river turned blood red. A stretcher platoon commander, I was lying down on the ground during the raids. My soldiers, otherwise called stretcher girls, were around me. After the bombing was over, I counted the number of survivors, 10 or so girls and a few stretchers. There were countless wounded soldiers around us, and saving them all was not that easy. Tears of indignation were coursing down my dusty face. I was in a quandary about what to do with so many men. The more we carried on stretchers, the greater the number of the wounded grew. It was heartbreaking that we had to pass the soldiers drawing their last breath. We heard another flurry of machine gun firing as enemy planes were swooping down. There I was, slightly out of breath from running. I nearly tumbled over, but rose up again to search for the wounded soldiers on the battlefield. Those with fatal injuries clung onto the legs of the stretcher girls and pointed at their belts. The girls knew what this gesture meant. Wiping away tears, they unhooked the belts and strapped them around their waists. Seeing the running girls with their own belts on, the soldiers smiled and drew their last breath. The belts were fitted with tags indicating the owners' positions and home addresses. They represented the soldiers' conscience and last wishes for the good of their country and family. Upon receiving the order for a strategic, temporary retreat on the Raktong River line, the surgeons who were attached to the 18th Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division gathered for an emergency meeting. A stout officer suggested leaving the wounded behind. Others remained dumb for a minute while I was stroking the belts on my waist. I jumped to my feet and protested against the proposal, stressing that we could not retreat without taking the soldiers with us. All gave me a dubious look. I dug my heels in, saying that we must go with them even though revolutionary organizations were active in the region and our army could come back there. I was so adamant that there was no further objection. Subsequently, a 50-strong group, including 10-odd stretcher girls, was organized for carrying the wounded soldiers, 5 being unable to walk and 30 or so with slight injuries. I was appointed head of this group. We all knew that arduous ordeals lay ahead. The enemy's hot pursuit and air raids slowed down our march during the day. Some submachine guns and rifles were all what we had, and the wounded soldiers had so much difficulty climbing mountains. Subsisting on several days' supply of food rations and attending to the seriously wounded during a break, we kept marching northwards. I was steadfast in my resolve to lead the entire group to where Supreme Commander Kim Il-sung was, without leaving any one of them behind, in the enemy-held area. Having been shot through one leg while fighting on the Raktong River, I had difficulty walking. Worse still, after each bombing raid, it took a few hours to bring all the soldiers together from all directions. Officers and senior soldiers discussed what needed to be done and adopted a resolution on reorganizing the group and establishing rigid discipline within it. Among the stretcher girls and the slightly wounded soldiers, those with rich experience were selected as scouts. Also, a command and liaison system was set up in consideration of varying circumstances. Near Taijon, we procured some medicines, but they were not so plentiful as we expected. Ri Chun-guan, a senior soldier of the 8th Company of the 3rd Battalion, and several other soldiers obtained new weapons at a railway station. Now, there was no unarmed soldier in my group. My biggest trouble was the shortage of medicines and cereals. Among the wounded, there were many who needed prompt medical treatment. Otherwise, they would die in agony. In the teeth of bombing raids, we searched around abandoned trucks for medicines. Sometimes we went down to nearby villages to obtain cereals and medicines. In the course of this, there were some intense clashes with South Korean soldiers and members of the Peace Maintenance Corps. When marching northwards around a reservoir in Hwacheon, we found one of the soldiers falling into a faint caused by excessive bleeding. We pitched tents in a hill for his treatment, and I myself gave the patient transfusion. Each time we encountered difficulties, I thought of the soldiers who had fallen and could not be saved on the Raktong River line. Those soldiers' belts worn around our waists awakened us to the importance of our mission. At long last, we arrived somewhere near Kosanjin. All were in ecstasy at the thought that we wrapped up the long march with credit. We felt as if we were brought again into the world, and our yearning for those whom we could not save by the river grew stronger. Long years have elapsed since the end of the war. Still vivid in my memory are the numerous soldiers who laid down their lives on the front line. Whenever I think of these martyrs, I harden my resolve to work as strenuously as in the days of the arduous march.